Denmark, a small Scandinavian nation that punches far above its weight in world history, home to the Vikings who once terrorized medieval Europe, the birthplace of design philosophy that shaped the modern world, a country synonymous with tall, blonde, blue-eyed descendants of Norse warriors. But what if everything we thought we knew about Danish genetics was incomplete? Recent groundbreaking DNA studies have revealed shocking truths about Danish ancestry. The genetic evidence tells the story of not one, but two complete population replacements of genetic invasions that wiped out entire populations within a single millennium, of a modern Danish population that's remarkably homogeneous on the surface, yet carries ancestry from across Europe and beyond. The Danes you see walking the streets of Copenhagen today are genetically different from the people who lived there during the Viking Age. And those Vikings, they were genetically different from the Bronze Age people before them. And those people completely replaced the Stone Age farmers who came before them. Today we're going to decode the DNA of Denmark. We'll uncover the truth about who the Danes really are, where they actually came from, and why modern Denmark represents one of the most dramatic genetic transformations in European history. This is Danish DNA Decoded. Let's start with a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about Danish history. In January 2024, researchers published what would become one of the most comprehensive genetic studies ever conducted on a single country, led by Professor Morten Erik Allentoft from Curtin University in Australia and the University of Copenhagen. The study was titled 100 Ancient Genomes Show Repeated Population Turnovers in Neolithic Denmark and appeared in the prestigious journal Nature. The team sequenced the complete genomes of 100 ancient individuals spanning 7,300 years of Danish prehistory, from the Mesolithic period through the Neolithic and into the early Bronze Age. They integrated genetic data with radiocarbon dating, isotope analysis for diet and mobility, and even pollen records to understand vegetation changes. What they discovered was shocking. As Professor Allentoft explained, archaeology has showed us how cultures have changed through millennia, but the DNA obtained from the old bones can tell us how the population itself was replaced by new immigrants arriving from elsewhere in Eurasia. The study revealed that Denmark experienced two complete population turnovers in just 1,000 years during the Neolithic period, not gradual mixing, not peaceful integration, complete replacement. The first turnover occurred around 5,900 years ago, when Neolithic farmers with ancestry from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and the Middle East arrived in Denmark. These weren't local hunter-gatherers learning to farm. These were entirely new people migrating from the south. The second turnover happened around 4,850 years ago, when people carrying Yamnaya ancestry from the Pontic Caspian steppe, the grasslands of modern Ukraine and southern Russia, swept across Denmark. Within a few centuries, they had replaced the Neolithic farmers almost entirely. According to archaeologist Dr. Anders Fischer, co-author of the study, before the influx of Yamnaya-related ancestry in late Neolithic Denmark, the territory had belonged to a farming population of strikingly different appearance and origin. And 5,900 years ago, the land belonged to a third group, namely hunter-gatherers. Both of these population turnover events were rapid, and with virtually no descendants of the predecessors. Professor Eske Willerslev, who led the research, stated, "Their genes remained. In Denmark and the rest of Scandinavia, and in much of the rest of northwestern Europe, genetically speaking, we are essentially Yamnaya to this day." This is the foundation of modern Danish DNA, a Bronze Age population formed by Yamnaya herders, mixing with remnants of Neolithic farmers, completely replacing the original hunter-gatherer inhabitants. The genetic transformation was so complete that the study found this dramatic shift from a Neolithic people with roots in what is now called the Middle East to a corded ware population with large quantities of Yamnaya ancestry happened about 5,000 years ago. This event created the genome of modern ethnic Danes, which have had no major genetic changes since then. But here's what's fascinating. Even though this Yamnaya-derived population formed the genetic base of modern Danes, the story doesn't end there. The genetic landscape would continue to be shaped by later migrations, particularly during the Viking Age. The laboratory work for this massive study was entirely performed at the University of Copenhagen. As Professor Allentoft noted, First, we extracted DNA from each specimen in our dedicated ultra-sterile labs, and then we sequenced all the genomes ourselves at our sequencing centre. This was a colossal undertaking, and nearly drove us crazy at times. The study also solved an ancient paternity case. Researchers found that a child buried near the famous Ertugrul man was actually his son, resolving a 6,000-year-old mystery through DNA analysis. One particularly interesting discovery involved two approximately 5,200-year-old male individuals found in Danish wetland deposits. These men had hunter-gatherer ancestry related to the pitted were culture from the Baltic island of Gotland in Sweden, proving that maritime contact and gene flow continued across Scandinavia even after the arrival of Neolithic farmers. The implications are profound. The Danish population of today didn't evolve gradually from ancient times. It was forged through dramatic replacements, invasions, and mixing events that fundamentally transformed the genetic landscape multiple times. To truly understand Danish DNA, we need to meet the three populations that once called Denmark home before modern Danes existed. The first people to settle Denmark arrived after the last ice age, around 10,500 years ago, as massive ice sheets retreated northward. These were hunter-gatherers of the Maglamos, Congomos, and later Ertugrul cultures, according to the 2024 Nature study by Alentoft et al. Danish Mesolithic individuals of the Maglamos, Congomos, and Ertugrul cultures form a distinct genetic cluster related to other Western European hunter-gatherers. Despite shifts in material culture, they displayed genetic homogeneity from around 10,500 to 5,900 calibrated years before present. These people were genetically fascinating. Research published in PLOS Biology in 2018 by Günther et al. Revealed that Scandinavian hunter-gatherers were a mixture of two distinct ancestral groups: Western hunter-gatherers from the south, about 57%, and Eastern hunter-gatherers from the northeast, about 33%, 43%. What did they look like? Probably quite different from modern Danes. The Western hunter-gatherer component typically had dark skin but blue eyes, a striking combination. They lived along Denmark's coasts, fishing, hunting seals, and following game. Analysis of their diet through isotope studies shows they relied heavily on marine resources. The Alentoft study emphasized their genetic continuity. In this part of the study, we end the debate on whether the various hunter-gatherer cultures represent different populations migrating to Denmark. There was clearly genetic continuity during the whole Mesolithic Stone Age period. For over 4,000 years, these people maintained a stable genetic profile despite changes in their material culture and tools. Then, around 5,900 years ago, everything changed. Around 5,900 years ago, a completely new population arrived in Denmark, Neolithic farmers, carrying ancestry from Anatolia and the Middle East, where agriculture was first developed. This wasn't a case of local hunter-gatherers adopting farming. The genetic evidence is clear. This was population replacement. The Alentoft study states Neolithic farmers with Anatolian-derived ancestry arrived and effectively replaced the hunter-gatherer population. These farmers brought with them domesticated plants and animals, pottery, polished stone tools, and a completely different way of life. They also looked different. Genetic analysis suggests they had lighter skin than the hunter-gatherers, but likely brown eyes and dark hair. The study found minimal mixing between the incoming farmers and local hunter-gatherers initially. Integration of pollen data revealed dramatic changes in vegetation coinciding with this population change as forests were cleared for agriculture. But these Neolithic farmers, who brought civilization and agriculture to Denmark, would only last about 1,000 years. Their time was short because something unprecedented was coming from the east. Around 4,850 years ago, the most dramatic genetic event in Danish history occurred: the arrival of people carrying Yamnaya ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. The Yamnaya were nomadic herders who had domesticated horses, invented wheeled vehicles, and developed a mobile lifestyle on the vast grasslands of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia, and they were on the move. As the 2024 study explains, the new population that emerged in Denmark 4,850 years ago in the late Neolithic was significantly influenced by the rapid spread of Yamnaya ancestry across Europe. The Yamnaya were nomadic herders with wheeled carts and wagons living in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. The Yamnaya didn't arrive directly from the steppe. They had already mixed with farmers in Eastern Europe, creating what archaeologists call the corded ware culture, known in Denmark as the single grave culture. This Yamnaya farmer gene mix entered Denmark and completely transformed the population. Professor Christian Christiansen from the University of Gothenburg, a collaborator on related research, explained, "Previously it has been assumed that we Scandinavians were descended from hunters and gatherers from the Stone Age, but this assumption has now been completely overturned. The replacement was swift and thorough. Within a few centuries, the Yamnaya-derived population contributed between 50 to 75% of Danish ancestry, the local Neolithic farmers, who had themselves replaced the hunter-gatherers just 1,000 years earlier, virtually disappeared from the genetic record." Dr. Fisher noted, "For an archaeologist, that's a profound discovery. What we do know is that in both cases, the existing populations, first the hunter-gatherers and next the descendants of Anatolian farmers, were displaced. How this happened remains somewhat mysterious. The study doesn't reveal whether this was violent conquest, disease, or simply demographic replacement through higher birth rates and better adaptation to local conditions. What we do know is that this Yamnaya-related ancestry brought dramatic changes, physical changes. The Yamnaya were very tall, and this genetic contribution made Northern Europeans, including Danes, among the tallest people in the world, Professor Allentoft explained. The Yamnaya were very tall, and populations with substantial Yamnaya ancestry in modern Europe are therefore taller. This applies strongly in Northern Europe, which has more Yamnaya ancestry. Linguistic changes. The Yamnaya brought Proto-Indo-European languages, which would eventually evolve into the Germanic languages, including Danish. Cultural changes. They brought new burial practices, single graves instead of megalithic tombs, new pottery styles, and new social structures. A 2024 study by Barry et al. In Nature found that Yamnaya ancestry also brought genetic variants that increased susceptibility to multiple sclerosis and other autoimmune diseases, but likely provided protection against infectious diseases at the time. This Bronze Age population, formed by Yamnaya-related peoples, mixing with remnants of earlier populations, created the genetic foundation that still defines Danish DNA today. Professor Willerslev summarized, "Genetically speaking, we are essentially Yamnaya to this day." If the Bronze Age created the genetic foundation of Denmark, the Viking Age would add unexpected complexity to the story. In September 2020, the largest genetic study of Vikings ever conducted was published in Nature. Led by Professor Eske Willerslev and Professor Martin Sikora, the study titled Population Genomics of the Viking World analysed DNA from 442 Viking Age individuals from across Europe and Greenland. The results challenged everything we thought we knew about Vikings, including Danish Vikings. The study found that just before the Viking Age, around 750 to 1050 AD, people from southern and eastern Europe migrated into Denmark, introducing DNA more commonly associated with Anatolia and other distant regions. As Professor Sikora explained, we found that Vikings weren't just Scandinavians in their genetic ancestry, as we analysed genetic influences in their DNA from southern Europe and Asia, which has never been contemplated before. Danish Viking Age sites showed remarkable genetic diversity. People buried with typical Viking grave goods in Denmark included individuals with ancestry from across Europe. Viking was clearly a cultural identity, not a genetic one. The 2020 study revealed distinct migration patterns for different Scandinavian populations, according to research reported in The Times. Researchers found that Vikings genetically similar to modern Danes and Norwegians tended to head west on their travels. Danish Vikings were particularly active in England. The study found evidence for a major influx of Danish ancestry into England during the Viking Age. This Danish influence contributed significantly to British genetics. Approximately 6% of people in the UK today carry Viking DNA, with the proportion likely higher in areas that were part of the Danelaw. Research by Leslie et al. In 2015 published in Nature on the fine-scale genetic structure of the British population confirmed substantial Scandinavian ancestry in eastern and central England, much of it specifically Danish. The genetic evidence shows that Danish Vikings didn't just raid England, they settled there, intermarried with local Anglo-Saxon populations, and left a lasting genetic legacy. Here's where things get surprising. The 2020 Viking DNA study revealed that Danish Vikings didn't necessarily look like modern stereotypes. The research found that Viking Age individuals had a higher frequency of genes linked to dark-coloured hair, subverting the image of the typical light-haired Viking. Most family members travelling and dying together. While most famous examples came from sites outside Denmark, the pattern of family-based Viking expeditions was widespread. The Viking Age was characterised by bidirectional gene flow. Danish ancestry flowed out to England, while ancestry from elsewhere in Europe flowed into Denmark. As the study concluded, additionally, we see substantial ancestry from elsewhere in Europe, entering Scandinavia during the Viking Age. This makes the Viking Age a period of genetic mixing and exchange, not genetic purity. Danish Viking Age towns like Hedeby, now in northern Germany but historically Danish, were cosmopolitan centres where people of diverse origins lived, traded and intermarried. By around 1050 AD, the Viking Age was ending. Denmark was Christianizing, centralizing politically, and becoming a medieval kingdom. But the genetic mixing that characterized this period had left its mark. The legacy of the Viking Age was a Danish population that combined its Bronze Age Yamnaya-derived base with additional genetic influences from across northern Europe and beyond. After thousands of years of population replacements and Viking Age mixing, what does modern Danish DNA look like? The answer surprised researchers. In 2016, researchers published a groundbreaking study in genetics titled Nationwide Genomic Study in Denmark Reveals Remarkable Population Homogeneity by Athanasiadis et al. This wasn't a typical genetics study. Researchers launched a nationwide science outreach project called Where Are You From?, inviting high school students across Denmark to participate. Around 800 students donated DNA samples and documented their ancestry. Lead researcher Georgios Athanasiadis from Aarhus University explained the project's unique approach. The response was overwhelming. We had more participants interested than the budget actually allowed us to genotype. When they analysed DNA from approximately 407 students, whose all four grandparents were born in Denmark, they made a remarkable discovery. Modern Danes are genetically one of the most homogeneous populations in the world. As Athanasiadis explained, I personally was surprised to see that all classical methods for detecting genetic structure in populations failed to pick up strong signals. Even cutting-edge methods returned very similar mixture profiles for all regions in Denmark. The study concluded, Denmark has played a crucial role in European history over the past 1,000 years, and the genetic signatures of its occupants can add perspective to that history. People whose ancestors all came from Denmark are genetically homogeneous. They found that the majority of Danish students were distantly related to each other, with no strong correlation between geography and genetics within Denmark. Even cutting-edge genetic analysis techniques couldn't find significant regional differences. But where does Danish ancestry come from? While Danes are homogeneous relative to each other, their ancestry is actually quite mixed when viewed in a broader European context. The study found that Danish ancestry comes primarily from three sources. British ancestry, 40 to 48%. Surprisingly, the largest single component, this likely reflects both ancient connections dating to the Mesolithic period and later Viking Age interactions. Swedish ancestry, 27 to 30%. The second largest component, reflecting Denmark's geographic position as part of Scandinavia. Norwegian ancestry, 14 to 19%. A smaller but significant Scandinavian component. Together, these three sources account for 82 to 97% of Danish ancestry. The Scandinavian component, Swedish plus Norwegian combined, surprisingly accounts for less than half of total Danish ancestry, 42 to 49%, roughly equal to the British component. Strikingly, the German component was minimal, only 3 to 7%, despite Denmark's long land border with Germany and historically fluid borders between the two countries. While overall homogeneity was remarkable, the study did detect subtle regional patterns. South Jutland showed the highest British ancestry, peaked at 48%. Zealand and Funen showed traces of Polish ancestry, corresponding to historical Wendish settlements. Eastern and southern Denmark showed slightly higher Eastern European ancestry. Several factors explain Denmark's genetic homogeneity. 1. Geographic size. Denmark is relatively small, facilitating internal gene flow. 2. Internal migration. Centuries of population mixing within Denmark blurred regional differences. 3. Population bottlenecks. Events like the Black Death reduced diversity. 4. Island effect. Much of Denmark consists of islands, creating somewhat isolated populations that later mixed. The study also tested whether genetic data could predict physical traits. Results were remarkable. We found that human height can be predicted with remarkable accuracy in Danish adolescents, with a prediction accuracy, R squared, of 0.639, meaning genetic factors explained about 64% of height variation. This high accuracy reflects both Denmark's genetic homogeneity and the strong genetic component to height in populations with substantial Yamnaya ancestry. The 2024 Ancient DNA study by Alentoft et al. Directly compared ancient Danish genomes with 2,000 modern Danish genomes from the ISPSYCH study, a major Danish psychiatric genetics research initiative. The results confirmed that modern Danes cluster closely with Bronze Age and Iron Age Danish populations, showing the remarkable genetic continuity since the Yamnaya-related population replacement 4,850 years ago. While traditional Danish genetics shows remarkable homogeneity, Denmark has become significantly more diverse through recent immigration. As noted in analyses of Danish appearance, Denmark has become more diverse due to immigration and globalization. Today, Denmark is home to people from the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and other European countries. This modern diversity represents a new chapter in Danish genetic history, though it hasn't yet significantly altered the genetic profile of Danes whose families have lived in Denmark for generations. What makes Danes look Danish? Let's examine the genetic basis of characteristic Danish physical traits. Modern Danes are exceptionally tall. According to demographic data, Danish men average about 181 centimeters, 5 feet 11 inches. Danish women average about 167 centimeters, 5 feet 6 inches. This places Denmark among the world's tallest populations. The genetic basis for this height traces directly to Yamnaya ancestry. As the 2024 Alentoft study explained, the people with Yamnaya ancestry replaced the Neolithic people about 5,000 years ago, and their genetics have made the present-day ethnic Danes and other populations in Northern Europe among the tallest in the world. A 2024 study published in Research Square, by examining 60 Caucasian populations, found that male height adjusted for major environmental factors is positively related mainly to ancestry components BHG, Baltic hunter-gatherers, Villabruna, and Yamnaya. The study confirmed that height correlates with specific Y chromosome haplogroups common in Denmark, particularly I1, I2, AP37.2, and R1BU106. However, height isn't purely genetic. The Alentoft study noted that Viking age Scandinavians were typically around 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 8 inches for men, significantly shorter than modern Danes. The increase reflects improved nutrition and living conditions in the modern era, combined with genetic potential. Denmark has one of the highest proportions of blue-eyed individuals in the world. According to genetic studies, approximately 60 to 70% of Danes have blue or green eyes, with only 30 to 40% having brown or hazel eyes. Research published in the American Journal of Human Genetics traces blue eyes to a single mutation in the OCA2 HERC2 locus that emerged 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. The variant RHAS 12913832 in HERC2 strongly correlates with blue eyes by reducing OCA2 expression and lowering melanin production in the iris. This mutation was already present in the earliest Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, according to the 2018 Gunther et al. Study in PLOS Biology, and persisted through subsequent population replacements. The high frequency in Denmark reflects both ancient inheritance and possibly continued selection. In Denmark's dim Nordic climate, Blue eyes may have been advantageous for letting in more light, though this remains debated among researchers. Blonde hair is strongly associated with Denmark. According to research by Frost, 2006, on European hair and eye colour, at least 60% of modern Scandinavian people have light hair, with Denmark showing particularly high frequencies. Studies in Nature Communications have identified specific alleles linked to blonde hair that reach especially high frequencies in Scandinavian and Baltic populations, sometimes exceeding 80% in certain regions. However, this is actually a recent phenomenon. The 2020 Viking DNA study found that many Vikings actually had brown hair, not blonde. Modern Danes have higher rates of blonde hair than their Viking ancestors, suggesting continued selection for this trait after the Viking Age. The MC1R gene primarily regulates hair colour. According to the allele frequency database, about 10.8% of Danes carry the T allele in the R151C, RS1805007 gene, where the TT variant typically causes red hair. Danes typically have fair or light skin, an adaptation to northern latitudes where sunlight is scarce, especially in winter. Research in Science, examining ancient European genomes, found that alleles for lighter skin in genes like SLC24A5, SLC45A2, and TYR underwent strong positive selection over the past 10,000 years. The Gunther et al. 2018 study found that genetic variants associated with light skin and eye pigmentation were carried, on average, in greater frequency among Scandinavian hunter-gatherers than their ancestors from other parts of Europe, suggesting local adaptation for vitamin D synthesis in low sunlight conditions occurred after these populations arrived in Scandinavia. The Yamnaya migration 5,000 years ago reinforced this trait, as Yamnaya populations had already adapted to northern conditions and carried light skin variants. Denmark, like other Scandinavian countries, has exceptionally high lactose tolerance rates. Over 95% of ethnic Danes can digest milk in adulthood. A 2021 study in Nature by Wilkin et al. Titled Dairying Enabled Early Bronze Age. Yamnaya steppe expansions found that the Yamnaya brought dairy farming practices around 5,000 years ago. However, the lactose tolerance gene, LCT-13910*T, was initially rare. A 2024 study examining 60 Caucasian populations found that the frequency of the European lactose tolerance associated allele 13910*T correlates primarily with Yamnaya ancestry and specific Y haplogroups common in Denmark, including I1, R1A, and R1B variants. The gene underwent strong positive selection because in Denmark's short growing season, dairy from cattle, sheep, and goats provided crucial year-round nutrition. Individuals who could digest milk throughout their lives had significant survival and reproductive advantages. The 2024 study by Barry et al. In Nature, titled Elevated Genetic Risk for Multiple Sclerosis, originated in steppe pastoralist populations, made a striking discovery. Yamnaya ancestry brought genes that increase risk for multiple sclerosis and other autoimmune disorders. Professor Willerslev explained, "With MS, you can see its Yamnaya ancestry, and the Yamnaya are basically Danes. Everything fits beautifully." The study found that variants in the human leukocyte antigen, HLA, complex, which regulates immune response, proliferated specifically in people with lots of Yamnaya ancestry. These likely provided protection against infectious diseases from domesticated animals, but came with trade-offs, including increased autoimmune disease risk. This is the price Danes pay for their Yamnaya heritage: height, strength, and disease resistance balanced against elevated autoimmune disease susceptibility. After examining thousands of years of genetic history, what does it mean to be Danish? The most important lesson from Danish DNA research is that Danish identity has always been about more than genetics. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age Yamnaya-descended peoples, and Viking Age Danes all called Denmark home, despite having dramatically different genetic profiles. As Professor Søren Sindbæk noted about the Viking study, importantly, our results show that Viking identity was not limited to people with Scandinavian genetic ancestry. The same principle applies to Danish identity throughout history. Denmark's genetic history is unique in its drama. As Dr. Fisher emphasized, both of these population turnover events were rapid, and with virtually no descendants of the predecessors. For an archaeologist, that's a profound discovery. Few places on Earth have experienced such complete genetic transformations. Denmark's history isn't one of gradual evolution, but of dramatic replacements, followed by long stability. The Afanasiadis study's finding of remarkable population homogeneity among modern Danes might seem to contradict this turbulent history, but it doesn't. Instead, it shows that after the Yamnaya-related population established itself 4,850 years ago, Denmark experienced relative genetic stability with gradual internal mixing. The homogeneity research is observed today is the result of this long period of internal gene flow within Denmark, combined with population bottlenecks that reduce diversity. Danish DNA also reminds us that no population is an island. The Afanasiadis study found that Danish ancestry is roughly half British, 1/4 Swedish, and 1/6 Norwegian, with smaller contributions from other European populations. Denmark sits at a crossroads between Scandinavia, Britain, and continental Europe. Its genetics reflect this geographic position and thousands of years of connections with neighbouring regions. Perhaps most striking is how dominant the Yamnaya genetic legacy remains. As Professor Willerslev stated, genetically speaking, we are essentially Yamnaya to this day. Nearly 5,000 years after the Yamnaya-related population arrived, their genetic contribution still forms 50 to 75% of Danish ancestry. Their genes gave Danes their height, their lactose tolerance, their susceptibility to certain diseases, and much of their genetic foundation. Danish DNA research continues to advance. The Danish National Genome Centre, established in 2019, is working on a strategy for personalised medicine that will sequence tens of thousands of Danish genomes. This research will undoubtedly reveal more about Danish genetic history, disease susceptibilities, and the fine-scale structure of the Danish population. Every new study seems to add complexity to our understanding. The story of Danish DNA is ultimately a story about change, adaptation, and survival. The people we call Danes today are the genetic descendants of Bronze Age migrants who replaced previous populations. They were shaped by Viking Age, mixing, medieval isolation, and modern homogenization. But they're also connected to the deep human past through the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who first settled Denmark 10,000 years ago, even if that genetic contribution is now minimal. As we continue to decode Danish DNA, we learn not just about Denmark, but about fundamental questions of human history. How do populations form? Why do some survive while others disappear? What makes a people? The answers written in Danish DNA are more complex and more fascinating than we ever imagined. The genetic secrets of Denmark remind us that history is never simple. The Danes didn't evolve gradually from ancient inhabitants. They were forged through dramatic replacements, invasions, and transformations that fundamentally reshaped the genetic landscape multiple times. Modern Danes carry genes from Siberian mammoth hunters, from Middle Eastern farmers, from Pontic steppe herders, and from Vikings who sailed to the ends of the known world. They're among the tallest people on Earth because of migrations that happened 5,000 years ago. They can drink milk because of genetic selection that followed the introduction of dairy farming. Every Dane carries a story written in their DNA, a story that connects them to epic migrations, to lost populations, and to transformations that changed the course of European history. The Vikings understood something we sometimes forget. Identity is something you create, not just something you're born with. It's time we remembered that lesson.